Posterior dislocation is otherwise a relatively simple condition in which basically the humeral head dislocates posteriorly. When it dislocates posteriorly, you will obviously see lesions that involve the posterior labrum, the posterior capsule, as well as the anterior humeral head. The anterior humeral head, because we're very clever people, instead of a Hill-Sachs, we'll call it a reverse Hill-Sachs. And instead of a Bankart, we'll call it a reverse Bankart. Extremely clever situation over here. So this is essentially the terminology that we have here. And for you to remember, as you're coming from posterior to anterior, you will see posterior glenoid involvement and capsular injury. You will see anterior humeral head bone marrow edema regularly, and you will see a discrete posterior labral tear. So when you see this combination of posterior labral tear with posterior capsular edema along with anterior humeral head edema, then you will start to think of somebody with a posterior dislocation. Now, given that posterior dislocations are something that don't happen very, very often, you need to remember what are some other common things that will give these appearances. So when you have posterior capsular edema, remember to look for inferior capsular thickening as well, because you may see this posterior capsular edema in somebody who's got adhesive capsulitis. You can also find that in somebody who's at an anterior dislocation, yes, they will definitely pull out their anterior glenoid and they will take out their anterior capsule. But while coming out, remember the posterior capsule will also have a pull. So you've got to be very careful that you haven't missed just an anterior dislocation with involvement of the posterior capsule as well. When you see a posterior labral tear, on the other hand, you've got to remember that they are more common because of posterior instability, which is sort of the chronic entity we talked about. And it can also be an anterior labral tear that is extending posteriorly. So remember to check for these two conditions. And when you see anterior humeral head or a reverse Hill-Sachs or a trough lesion, in other words, you see some deformity of the anterior humeral head, first of all, it's quite common. The second thing that you will see along with that is you can have subscapularis insertional edema or cystic change, which can give that edema or that appearance. So in summary, what we've discussed is anterior dislocations. We've talked about anterior inferior labral lesions, glenoid bone loss, and the Latarjet. We've talked about Hill-Sachs lesions, the engaging and non-engaging ones. We've talked about remplissage, posterior instability, and posterior dislocation.